All right, welcome back to Ars Politica, and good evening or good afternoon, wherever you're at right now. So, about an hour ago, I finished up a recording in which I responded to an article Neil Shenvi talked about with regard to the woke right, as he calls it. The sound quality was not good because the mic was not on. I was using a different mic, but it came out okay. So, but now we're going to do round two, or we're going to try this again, but on a different part of the essay that he wrote. This is a part on ethnicity. I didn't get to this. I kind of forgot about it, but I'm going to do it as a standalone, recorded instead of live, and it's on his view of ethnocentrism. He this is one of the dangers he thinks is inherent to the woke right. He says ethnic identitarianism, meaning the exaltation of your ethnic identity over your identity in Christ, is a major problem on both the woke left and the woke right. Okay. So let me say first of all, I have made the argument, and I did in my book, that your unity in Christ does not provide a set of cultural norms by which you can live together in a political society, such that you can maximize the good of that society. And so this should be kind of self-evident in one sense, because the gospel does not bring about with it a united language. I'm not talking about a figurative language of the gospel or worship, but I'm talking about an actual language by which you can do the sorts of things you do in society every day, which is communicate to coworkers, to the grocery store, or even talk about higher things like philosophy, or even go and listen to a sermon. The gospel does not provide those things by which you can get along and complete common projects. And you can expand out that from different cultural norms, social expectations, manners. The reason why people, even in Christian colleges, can tend to group around people who are similar to each other, is that they can relate to one another with ease, without any sort of hindrance. And so the projects that we do in the world can be done with ease as well. This is so. The point being, and I'll get to it more. This is kind of the introduction. Is that we can't say that our unity in Christ, our identity in Christ, is sufficient to have a political society that would essentially achieve any good at all. So if you take this thought experiment, that if you were to take the Christians, just let's say, just you somehow you could pluck randomly all true Christians from all around the world and place them in a political system. Christians who are in Mongolia, these are Christians who are in United States and Mexico and Argentina and South Africa and Zimbabwe, everywhere. Okay, Hungary, everywhere. And you put them into a political society, and you said, "All right, organize." Well, first of all, you'd run into the problem that most people, I guess, maybe they'd speak English, maybe they. So I guess you English speakers would do okay. But probably you'd find Africans getting together, Africans and Europeans getting together with Europe. But anyway, apart from that, would that society, compare that society, whatever would happen in that, compare that society to a just anyone from Idaho, and you went blink and you put them down and you said, okay, it doesn't matter. I'm not saying they're Christian or not. Anyone from Idaho, you pick a random 1,000 people and you place them down. My bet is that the people of Idaho can form a political society far easier and better and flourishing than the one from that you just randomly pick a bunch of people from around the world. And why is that? Well, because people in Idaho tend to, on average, have similar history, similar cultural values, even similar religious values, even if they're not practicing, like they're even if they're nominal Christians. So the point being is that actually what makes a functioning political civil society, with the same political principles and way of life, those societies with similarity are ones that flourish best. And the gospel does not provide sufficiently what you would need to have a functioning civil society such that people would have the complete good. So it really is a non-starter from the get-go to say your identity of Christ is the basis of a civil society. And so we have to keep that in mind as we go through this. So let me pull this up so we can look it over a bit. I've already kind of commented on what he said there in the very beginning. Exaltation. He says exaltation. I think from the very beginning, he's actually misunderstanding what someone who would be quote ethnocentric would want to affirm. In fact, in the old paleoconservative tradition, your regional identity, which I guess you could say would be your people, it's less an exaltation than it is saying this is our way of life and we respect yours, which is different, and we want to essentially have mutual like harmony, but at the same time we are a people and you are a people and we should then respect each other at a distance. So that's kind of a paleoconservative model, which you see all across the world. It's not just an American thing. So it's not necessarily an exaltation. That is a vice, but that's not necessarily inherent to saying, okay, we are a people and you're a people, and we ought to be remain different. So he does actually right here kind of steel man it, I guess, um, the argument for quote ethnocentrism. But let's just jump in right to what the problems. The major problem with the racism skeptics argument. So right off the bat, he is conflating ethnicity and race. Okay, so this would I suppose mean that by ethnicity, the white ethnicity is everything from I don't know the backcountry Idahoan to the Moscow, to everyone in that is Moscow, Russia, to Russians. That's all. That's everyone. But in fact, I would argue that in terms of immigration, I wouldn't prefer anyone. I don't want actually white people to immigrate here because they'd probably vote for Democrats. But anyway, so he's conflating terms between ethnicity and race. Even if you want to say that race is purely a matter of bloodline and ancestry, that still doesn't mean that it is necessarily racist. In fact, you could deny another white ethnicity entrance on the basis of different ethnicities. So he's already kind of causing problems there by bringing up racism, but it's a good rhetorical move, even though it's actually bad in terms of its logic. And who is my neighbor? The very question the Pharisees posed to Jesus. So this is one of the problems. He is actually begging the question. That is, he is misunderstanding the argument. The argument for someone who says you should love those of your ethnicity more than those not of your ethnicity are not saying that you should not treat other people as neighbors. So it's a question of preference. It's a question of duty. Who should you love more? And so at this bolded thing, which he likes to bold things, God precisely because it refuses to limit the bounds of our neighbor love to our people. No one, not even the most hardcore kinist, is saying that you limit the bounds of your neighbor love to our people. So right off the bat, he is actually critiquing a straw man. That's a very common straw man that you see all over the place of people who want to argue against the kinist or the ethnocentric or the white nationalist or whatever. This is the kind of argument that they want to make. Of course, it's false. Every kinist that I know would deny that. They actually believe that, let's say they're white and they see a black man who's in the ditch, or maybe his car has flown off the side of the road and they need aid. They would see it as their duty to help that man because he's in need. So really, and treat him as a neighbor. So even in that case, the most extreme kind of racialist type kinist would still see a duty in helping a fellow human being who is not white, who in other circumstances they would prefer the whites over the blacks. So right off the bat, Neil is not doing good. The solution, the tension between love our neighbor and loving those closest to you is recognized. So he wants to say, Your neighbor is not all people everywhere, neither is your neighbor only people of your own ethnic group. Instead, your neighbor is anyone along your path, anyone you meet in front of you at the moment. Now, what Neil is doing here is he's failing to distinguish the duties of ethics and then the duties of political life or politics. Okay, this is a very crucial distinction. So it is true that anyone along your path, doesn't matter if you're a hardcore racialist, kinist, or whatever, is your neighbor and ought to be an object of love of people in need. Okay, like the Good Samaritan. Everyone affirms this. I think all the kinists would affirm this, but this is a matter of like sort of individual ethics. It's a matter of individual ethics. So let's take an example, a distinction between ethics and politics in a circumstance. Let's say you come across someone who is an illegal immigrant, and that illegal immigrant just came across the border and is dying of thirst or starving or something like that. And you come across this person, you have a individual duty, an ethical duty to feed and to give water to this person. Of course, if you're able, if you have water and food, you give to the person. But as a political duty, you have a duty then to turn that person into the proper authorities, and you could have a and you could have a desire out of love for your country to see that person deported from the country, which they don't want. So like that is the individual who just crossed the border doesn't want that. So you can see how you can have a political duty and an ethical duty, and they're not in tension. They're not they're not contradictory. They're just different spheres of duty. Okay, so yeah, the illegal immigrant, you feed, clothe, give water, but also give the authorities to see deported, and you can support the law that ultimately deports that person. Jesus commands you to love the person actually in front of you, regardless of whether they are one of your own. Yeah, everyone affirms that, just did. Or a member of an ethnic group that your ethnic group hates. Okay, well, you brought in the word hates, but that's sure. Okay. The biggest problem with racism is not the fact that you love your own, but the fact that you fail to love your neighbor. Well, the question is, who is actually doing that? In that example of the immigrant, am I failing to love that person as a neighbor if I feed, clothe, give something to drink, but then turn them into the authorities to be deported? I'm actually, if I don't fulfill the political duty, I'm actually failing to love my neighbors in broader society who now have to pay for that person's social care and children's education, and now has to teach that person English or whatever. Um, so yeah, I think Neil is obviously failing to understand so racists justify their ethnic partiality. So you obviously see again a conflation of race and ethnicity by constructing a completely abstract hierarchy in the name of rightly ordered loves. Well, that's actually entirely false. I wonder if he read my book. I know he did, because it's not actually entirely arbitrary. Why? Why in the world would we want to say it's good to have a people who are tied to a place who then want to make that place and the people have continuity over time? Well, because most of our life is conducted with particular things, customs and traditions and manners and understandings of one another. We speak the same language, we have the same music, the same dances, the same folk tales, the same nursery rhymes. We have all these things that are similar to one another, so that we can understand one another. We can correct one another in their errors because we have a mutual understanding. We know what in this place right looks like. Okay. And more than that, that's just a snapshot in time. But then take it broader to beyond that, to continuity of the place, meaning that my people, out of gratitude for my people, are the ones who fought in this war or settled this land or built these buildings. That's not abstract hierarchy. It's a function of gratitude. These people built this stuff for me and their grandchildren and their great grandchildren. And they left it behind. They died as a gift. Our world, our society is a gift of the people who loved us and wanted to see these things flourish. And we have a duty to that. And that would be a political, or you could say it's a collective duty. And that does not conflict with our individual ethics towards the outsider, but it does not obligate us to have to treat that outsider as one of us automatically somehow. There's duties of hospitality, but as guests, they can outlive their welcome and they can go because they can undermine the good of the group. Just like in a household, you are you receive people in your house as an act of gratitude. But if they start stealing your stuff or they disrupt the way of life of that household, eventually, you got to say, look, you're actually harming my own household. You got to go. So again, Neil is just failing to make this distinction. I don't know if it's a basic or obvious distinction, but this is how we think, like all the time. It's absolutely not an abstract hierarchy. The the purpose of human society. Why do we as creatures organize as groups? Because there's something good in existing in a group. And so the question then is, what are the sort of things that produce the maximum good among human groups or human society? And it's not just universal notions. It's not just it's not even shared principles of right and wrong. It's how those are applied, how those are brought out, how those are expressed in very particular ways. And so all those things that are second nature to us, but not first nature because they're cultural or particular. Those things are transmitted to our kids, and we want our kids to who go over to other kids' houses to learn generally the same things, to have the same cultural norms and expectations, and and that's a duty. So that there's goods in there because there's a goods wrapped up in all those things. You then go from goods to okay, what are our social political duties? And that includes having some kind of group, I don't know, group identity, but a group particularity that should be preserved. And so for the love of your neighbor, you ought to actually ought to have a duty to them, which is preserving the good things that essentially make human society good unto its completion or perfection or whatever. So it's absolutely not uh, abstract to think that way. In fact, to not prefer your people ordinarily is to failure to love your neighbor. Now, there's all people groups would require usually some kind of critique or criticism, but that's done out of love as well. But you're not see Neil has this. He collapses all of our duties to individual encounters and fails to see the human person as a member of groups, and then to see that the ethics of groups or the principles that make groups good are different than the principles that make one-to-one interactions good. And I think that's just a basic. I'm not even like going to appeal to the political tradition, even though that's like basic, but it's just basic experience. Again, the legal immigrant, you help that person at an individual level, but then you hope to you see them deported. Okay. So now the pastor's Orthodox. God, now he's talking about like in the church context. Um, the white man leaves the church because he feels more comfortable with his own people and defends his actions on the grounds that he is just loving his kin. Now, the idea of feeling more comfortable with your people, this doesn't mean like if you have a pastor who's an outsider of from the people, and he's brought in, that's an act of hospitality. And so it would be wrong if that pastor showed up and started preaching from the pulpit about how bad your society is. My society back home in Africa is so much better. That would be bad. And I'd be like, dude, w- you're a bad guest and to this place. Of course, like friendly critiques are in order, but yeah, there's an act of hospitality. So I don't even know. Like I think Neil is just funnily misunderstanding the duties involved here. between individuals, between groups. That groups can have practice hospitality to outsiders, at the same time prefer their own, at the group level. But you can interact. Like I have a good friend from Singapore, and I like hanging around him and all that. But he wouldn't fit in the United States. Like he's from Singapore. Like he fits in Singapore, but he wouldn't fit in here. At the individual level, I can see he and I could be great friends. This is true for all sorts of foreigners, but that doesn't mean that I would want a million of him in this country. He wouldn't want a million of me in his country. And so even though on the individual, we can be friends. And even if he wanted to move here and he wanted to, I think it'd be fine as an act of hospitality to bring an outsider in, just like it as an immigrant. But to have a million or 10 million of them, that's a whole different question, because that gets in the matter of the group, infecting the group. So I think that Neil's entire discussion here is just muddled. It misunderstands individual and group dynamics, political and ethical dynamics. Okay, if you disobey Jesus' command to love your actual neighbor by speculating how much he would not be your neighbor at all in your imaginary ideal society, you're making precisely the same mistake Pharisees made with precisely the same motivation. So I don't know anyone who's going to speculate. Again, he's confusing the different, the political and the ethical in this exact same way. Yeah. And again, it's one thing to have someone come into your society as a guest who is an object of hospitality. And it's a whole other thing to bring in a million of them and then suddenly call them citizens because you have to love them at individual level. That doesn't work. And why is that bad? It's not because of an absolute divine, scriptural command. It's bad because it undermines the conditions for societies to maximize the good of its members. Okay. This is not a question of these divine command theory ethics that we're working through. It's a question of we are a rational animal that is a social being that lives in societies. What maximizes the good for us in a society? It's just also stupid. But anyway, okay. In summary, racism, ethnic partiality can be defined as showing partiality toward your ethnic group, such that you violate the second greatest commandment to love our neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. Again, it actually doesn't. To show partiality towards a people group as a collective duty in a political sense is actually the only way, ordinarily, I should say, that you can love your neighbor as yourself. Now, as an ethical matter, on an individual level, as I've said, you ought to love all people when they're in need. But as a policy, political matter, and as a sentiment in the group level, you in fact ought to prefer your ethnic group or your people group, precisely so that you can love your neighbor as yourself. Given that Jesus explains the command to love your neighbor as yourself in terms of treating others the way you want to be treated, a simple test of ethnic partiality is this: would you want your neighbor to treat you the way that you treat him? In other words, would you want him to give the job to a less qualified candidate who shared his ethnicity? The irony here is he's actually speaking to white people who never do this. And actually it's the opposite nowadays. This only happens to non-white people. They obviously are, again, would you want him to ignore you when you visit his church? Again, who's doing that? Would you want him to ascribe negative stereotypes to you because of your ethnicity? Again, that's a question of treating individuals as individuals and groups as groups. All these are just dumb questions. But again, I said in the live video a couple hours ago, that basically Neil operates with this kind of low information, average IQ, women and also their men. And so his arguments are basically along these lines that are not very, it's like the Joel Berry level of intelligence. It's just not very, very significant, and it influences these kind of weak Anyway, but the point is the point is that would you want your neighbor to treat the way you treat? Well, this is what I would want. Um, I would want at the group level to be treated with hospitality as a guest, and I would expect them to expect me that to act as a guest in a foreign country. That is, I don't meddle in their affairs. I appreciate with gratitude what they're doing for me. I would not try to undermine their their system, their culture. Um, and I would only show appreciation, and I'd exist in quietness in a society that is fundamentally not mine. That's what I would expect, and that these would be wrong for me to show up and be like, "Oh, this is we're all just a bunch of humans here, universal man. That's what we are." And then like, "Oh yeah, you guys don't have a culture. I have the culture. You guys need to bow down to me." No, that's just no. Um, yeah, and the same way, if I'm just like if I'm down in the ditch and I need help, I'd expect anyone to help me because I need help, and that's the same thing I would do. And any of any of the most racialist kinists, I believe that at least they would affirm that they should do that, just like anyone else. And as I know many of them, I think they all would do that. In fact, I know people in the South, in the midst of floods, would jump in their boat and save a lot of people who were not like them in the when there was flooding in different places. So I do know that they are the good Samaritans, and they're the same sort of people that Neil would see canceled and fired. So, um, yeah, which is I guess ironic here. Um, Yeah. Anyway, the whole argument is bad. It misunderstands basic points, or the basic distinction between politics and ethics, between individual interaction and group interaction. It misunderstands that the reason for group preference is because groups have different principles and conditions for good than individual interactions. And so you then have to relate to it and you have different duties. Those duties are not in conflict, they're not disharmonious, they're complementary, but they are different. And this is why, by the way, in the Reformed tradition, not so much today because we've lost it, but in the old days, people would distinguish between ethics and politics because ethics dealt with like individual stuff, and politics would deal with more group dynamic, like obviously the civil order and polity and the Republican, that sort of thing. But anyway, I don't think there's any. Let's see if there's anything else here. No. Oh yeah, he critiques me. Okay, let's go into here. They cannot have a life together that goes beyond mutual alliance. Note here that Wolf is assuming unusual definition. Actually, it's not unusual. It's just Neil doesn't know the people who use it. This is completely wrong. Not just a piece of political law, but a matter of ecclesiology. Yeah, no, I'm actually not talking about the church there. I'm talking about politics. So it is absolutely the case that if you have different ethnicities with different cultures, different even just different languages, different traditions, different pastimes, I don't know, I could go on and on and on. It is true that the best you can do together ordinarily is a type of mutual alliance for good, that you can do commerce. You could hire the person to mow your lawn, but are you going to share in the same political principles, the same ancestry, the same connection to historical events? Are you going to be able to communicate at the highest levels? No. Again, the gospel, even in the church context, um, this is again where like we're called to have Christ's life together. Okay, well, which language do we speak in Neil's? I'm guessing it's English. Well, I'll just speak English, and and that'll be the basis for our yeah. That's the English is the divine language. So of course I'm right. We cannot, or they cannot have a life together that goes beyond mutual alliance. By the way, that's just a basic Aristotelian point from book 3 of his Politics. That's what I'm getting that from. He says completely wrong. Actually, he's completely wrong, and it's obviously completely wrong. My bet is that when Neil goes to his Bible studies, they're all speaking English. That's just my guess. And that's not a divine language. He should try to have a mutual a life together in the fullness of it in a civil polity that seeks after the greatest good for the people in that group with people who don't speak the same language. So it's just silly. I don't know if it's this is where like this is where I've run into problems with people who cannot think outside of these theological categories. And it's like it's why one reason why I don't like worldview talk either. Like they can't think outside of just your basic experience looking around. Sociological categories, political categories, ethical. It's all got to be these theological things. But then never actually do you see this make any sense like in the actual world we live in. Or you actually have to deal with the fact that we are human creatures who exist on Earth who navigate this world together, and we have to kind of open our eyes to see how things operate. Okay, and most people did this, like they could think through these things better. Um, we are a family. We're called to see ourselves as a family. We're called to view one of those brothers and sisters bound with spiritual ties, even stronger those bind our biological family. Okay. Um, uh, okay. Does this mean that you don't have preference for your own children over the other children in the church? The problem with ethnic views the woke right is often given a pass because wokeness views a political project. Political speculations will almost unavoidably impact the day-to-day realities of our spiritual life. For example, is it really plausible to think that a woke right Christian who believes that the U.S. culture and government ought to center Anglo Protestant norms will never be tempted to think that his local church culture ought to be center Anglo norms as well? Okay, tempted to do that? Most likely your church does actually centered around Anglo Protestant norms. I mean, of course, it does. Open go to an OPC or PCA church, and you're singing mostly songs written by white people historically in this country or in England or Scotland. And then if you go to a mega church, it's centered around kind of a white middle class ethos. So even I mean, apart from like that's probably besides the point a little bit, but it already is the case. And the fact that you look around and it could be diverse is because Anglo Protestantism is a very open. It has an extreme openness to it. That like a black church, the reason why it's not diverse in part is because there's not a strict sort of openness to it. Whereas that's why you have mixed ethnicity or race within a largely Protestant church that has essentially Anglo foundation to it. Um, but again, like the whole idea are they might be tempted to think this. Okay, I mean, my the church I go to, a Presbyterian church, is thoroughly Anglo-Protestant. I mean, I don't know how to I mean, you open up the hymns and it's like, okay, that's from England. Okay, that's Fanny Crosby. But you're looking at the hymns, and this, of course, it is. And then the fact that we sit there and we listen to a guy talk, and we are almost motionless and we're quiet, and it's got this sort of order to it. And of course, that's like Anglo Protestant. Am I tempted to think that it ought to be that way? Yeah, I want it to be that way. That's why I go to that church. People who go to that church probably don't even like a lot of people don't even probably realize what we're doing, that it is actually very much a cultural thing that we're engaged in. But they prefer that. Now, does that mean like I don't even know like who's thinking this, but the fact that someone might be tempted to think something is not an argument against it. The fact of the matter, there's a strong argument that many have made for a long time that actually our political life, what has made the country great, is that it's been Anglo-Protestant. That our tradition of religious liberty is Anglo-Protestant. That our tradition of liberty in general is Anglo-Protestant, that our tradition of equality, like ordered liberty, ordered with equality, is Anglo-Protestant. People have recognized this from Italians to all sorts of to foreigners who come here recognize what this country has founded upon. So, will the impact to day-to-day spiritual life? Well, I mean, I hope it's just that's actually kind of a Jesus juke. I mentioned this in the live talk. It's a Jesus juke, meaning that it's instead of dealing with the thing itself, you say, well, it might harm something higher spiritual. so you shouldn't do it. It's a fallacy. It's a form of red herring fallacy. All right, let's keep moving on. I didn't know I was even going to go for this long. So CJ Engel doesn't like rap. Okay. Well, I guess he doesn't like rap. Okay, that's good. Does Neil like rap? Does Neil listen to a lot of rap? Yeah, he. I want to see him rap or listen to rap. I see the woke right as an overcorrection of the big ubiquitous but falsely mantra diversity is our strength. Repeated command to subordinate our personal preferences for the benefit of others. If the rule applies to non-essential theology, so yeah, what if that actually maintaining group solidarity and similarity in the civil society is actually the benefit for others? What if the human being as a social creature requires similarity to maximize benefits in a group setting? And I would argue that it absolutely does. And so, again, it misunderstands the basic argument. So, if this rule applies to non-essential theological differences, how much more should apply differences in mere cultural preference? I mean, actually, in a way, cultural preference at the civil society level is more important than non-essential theological differences, because you can have Baptists and Presbyterians and Anglicans. Just take the early American, take like the American founding generation. You had people there who were Congregationalist and Presbyterian and Anglican. There weren't too many Baptists, but I mean Baptists were like public intellectuals back then. But just the generation itself had a wide diversity, but culturally very similar. And so, actually, in the civil sphere, culture preferences matter a great deal, and I would argue more than non-essential theological differences. Even like essential theological differences in certain settings would matter less than cultural similarity. So you can have someone like a Unitarian like John Adams, who was devout along Unitarian lines, but also basically an Anglo Protestant like everyone else, because essentially Unitarianism is a like a Anglo Protestant heresy, and so it's a theologically heterodox, but culturally, at least back then, it was far more aligned with the norm. In fact, John Adams was more conservative than other people who were actually more orthodox. So anyway, that's what I would argue. Then he goes into Godel speech and behavior. I won't go into that. It's all accidental to the argument. But anyway, so he doesn't like ethnocentrism, but the whole argument from top to bottom is bad. Then he kind of goes into, let's see, summary, the horseshoe theory, and somehow the center is just right, just right. The post-war liberalism is just right. Okay. So in summary, pretty much all of Neil's arguments are either rely on question begging assumptions, or a straw man argument, or failure to make distinctions, failure like missing the point, or the Jesus juke red herring. And I'll just leave it at that. So I would hope that in the future his arguments would be better, though I just don't think that it will be the case, because he tailors his arguments to his audience, and so. But anyway, that's my response, and have a great rest of your evening.